Well, it turns out Putin's price hike isn't working out for rebranding inflation. New polling from CNBC shows Biden's approval rating taking a nosedive over economic concerns and inflation. Biden's approval rating slid to a new low of just 38%, according to the survey, which found only 1 in 5 described their financial situation as getting ahead, the weakest in 8 years. And according to a new Quinnipiac poll, Biden's approval rating with Hispanics dipped to just 26%, the lowest of any demographic besides young people. Only 21% of people aged 18 to 34 approve of Biden's job handling.
Our rising panel is here to discuss the numbers. Council member at large of Montgomery County, Maryland, Will Jawando, and Republican strategist Melik Abdul join us now to discuss. Welcome to you both.
Good morning. Good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So, Will, these numbers are just terrible. They keep getting worse every time you think, well, how much lower can Biden sink? He sinks lower. What possibly can the party even do at this point to reverse these numbers and, to prepare themselves for what looks to me like the inevitability in November, which is going to be catastrophe?
Yeah, well, as you were speaking, I was saying it's reminding me of a luau. How low can you go here? Mm-hmm. It's not pretty, and I think the higher a gallon of milk goes up, the higher the gas prices go up. This is real, and people feel it every day. And look, there's always context is important. There's always the president in power always loses in the midterms. There's always difficulty, but we're in uncertain times coming out of a pandemic. Obviously, the health pandemic doesn't rate high on people's minds, but we're still dealing with the inequity and economic fallout. And then we've got the war on top of it. So it's a problem. In this same poll, though, you did see that, 66% of folks blame corporations for taking advantage. I think another 55% blame Vladimir Putin and 49% blame Joe Biden on why the prices have gone up, but it doesn't help him with his overall rating. But it shows that there's a lot of blame and anger to go around. And when prices are this high, people look to who's in charge, and whether rightly or fairly or not, and say, what are you going to do about it?
Well, Melik, it's interesting to contrast this with Trump's approval ratings. Obviously, the last year of his presidency was also marred by the pandemic, and yet in some ways didn't quite dip to these depths at this juncture. Do you think this is all circumstantial, or does it have something to do with specifically how Joe Biden is leading in this moment?
I think it has a lot to, actually more so to do with the expectations that people had with Joe Biden coming into office, because Joe Biden really did promise a lot of things about what would be different now under his presidency, but it failed to actually capture the realities of the ground of what people are feeling. So yes, coming out of the pandemic, there was a lot of economic anxiety. There was a lot of anxiety all around the country, but also now we're dealing with inflation. And I think that the numbers are really showing they've been trending in the Republican direction for some time now. Even most recently, I think that was the Wall Street Journal poll that showed that the approvability factor for Republican candidates among Blacks and Hispanics has really, I think it's probably about a 6% or so, but it's really substantial. I think that there were a number of things that people expected Biden to do in office, and many of those expectations were unrealistic, but Biden is now having to deal with overpromising a lot of things and the realities of governing. So I think this is something that we will continue to see, and I don't think it's necessary, because we've seen so many polls moving in the same direction, we're beyond circumstantial now. This seems like this is laying the blueprint for what we're going to see in the midterms.
Well, Melik says that it's an expectation gap and that some of the promises were unrealistic. Others are quite realistic. There are things that progressives have been highlighting exactly because they can be executed by Biden via executive order. And there are also issues that disproportionately affect the base, Blacks and Latinos, who, as we see from the polls, are shifting away from support of Joe Biden. What do you make, in particular, of Joe Biden's reluctance to go ahead and fulfill his promise, not just to cancel at least $10,000 of student debt, but to also cancel all HBCU debt for people who earn less than $125,000 a year, which was a campaign promise that it seems most people have forgotten at this point?
Yeah, well, there were a lot of expectations, and I think a lot of people were happy with the shift back to some sort of normalcy. If you take the nomination and confirmation of Judge Ketanji Jackson Brown, excuse me, that normally would be a huge bump for a president. You're not seeing that, right? These are unusual times. I think the extension of the delay on student loan payments was a good thing. I mean, I agree. I think we should be moving towards cancellation, at least for a large percentage of debt for folks that are really, really struggling. That would help at an economic time. The child tax credit, we weren't able to get that, and Senator Joe Manchin was a big part of that, not being willing to extend that. You're seeing that people have stopped receiving that. And so I think there is some angst about, well, what's going to happen. And then if you look at one of the major accomplishments, the infrastructure bill, you're really not going to see that. Americans aren't going to see the impact of that for a couple of years. And so that's the issue, too, is we're just now getting the money as local elected officials, states and local governments, and deciding how to get those projects going. So it's really, I think, a combination of the context of an incumbent president always loses seats, and then this massive inflation, this war, and coming out of COVID, which was always going to have a long tail because of how inequitable it wreaked havoc on our economy and on certain communities like the ones we're talking about.
Well, last week, Deutsche Bank became the first major bank to forecast a recession. And now we are hearing a similar cry from Bank of America, who warns that high inflation is out of control and predicts a recession as the Fed raised interest rates to get prices under control. The risk there is that the Fed will do too much and sink the economy in the process. What are you making of this right now, Melik?
And so this is something that I think we've been watching probably since maybe around this time last year, what the economists were saying, what Wall Street is saying. Obviously, the hope is that we don't enter into a recession, but I think it's a very difficult thing, and people need to be realistic in that this is not, the president does not control whether or not inflation any more than oil companies control the price of gas at the pump. So this is, some of the things are kind of built in, but I just wanted to address one of the things that you actually said about the things that minorities, particularly African Americans, are concerned about. I'm not sure exactly. So those big things, the voter reform bill, even things like the college tuition, keep in mind these things are constituency. So not every Black person went to college. Not every Black person has college tuition high on their list. The same thing with the voting rights legislation, police reform. We know that the Republicans tried to get that through when Trump was in office, and it didn't happen under Trump. And now that Biden is in office, it didn't happen then. But if you look at the polling numbers, while those things may actually rank well as far as polling, they're not the top concerns when you have our kitchen table issues. The price of chicken, the price of vegetables even are exponentially higher than what they were around this time last year, even when at the height of the pandemic, when Trump was in office. So it's a lot of juggling going on. And that's why I mentioned earlier, talking about the unrealistic expectations that somehow the college tuition, that thing was going to be a real thing, that he was going to eliminate the debt for HBCUs. But I guess if you are Black and probably went to a PWI, predominantly white institution, you may not get that same elimination of debt. So I just thought it was a very unrealistic goal overall, but we're really dealing with the realities of governance right now, not just campaign promises, but governing.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It is fair to say that most people don't have student debt. 44 million people do, however, and it's disproportionately concentrated among Black women are the largest percentage-wise debt holders. The reason we constantly talk about student debt, or I should say I constantly talk about student debt, I will fully admit, is not because I believe, to your point, Melik, that it's Americans' highest priority. It absolutely is not. And if there was some policy that Joe Biden could enact by executive order without having to go through Congress, I would absolutely be emphasizing that as well. I think medical debt cancellation cancellation, for instance, should be a huge priority. But I will note that if we're talking about child tax credits, the constant refrain isn't that, well, a lot of Americans don't have kids. If we're talking about housing reform or mortgage subsidy.
Well, no, that's a good point against the child tax credit, in my view.
It seems like it's okay to do a lot of different things for a lot of different constituencies, with an understanding that not everybody belongs to every constituency, but there has been a particular resistance to doing the one of the few things that Joe Biden can actually do by executive authority, and which can be a substitute for millions of people who are having to afford higher priced groceries, et cetera, to not have to pay another $1,000 in student loan debt is meaningful for them.
I suspect this is why actually Andrew Yang and his policies have resonated with so many people who watch this show. For instance, the kind of payments to everyone, independent of circumstance, independent, the guaranteed basic income kind of proposal, because it gets around some of this. But we got to go in a minute. But Will, I just wanted to get your reaction to. I wanted to specifically address those Hispanic numbers are so bad. What do you think is going on? With that specifically, are Hispanics Republicans now? What's going on?
No, I think. Well, look, the Latino community has always been very diverse. I think there's always the unfortunate kind of urge to lump people together. And like the older African American community, there are, some strings of conservatism, moderate folks in those communities, depending on the issues. So, I think, again, you'd have to dig deeper into those crosstabs, but I think those economic issues are paramount. If you look at Latino and African American communities, I think that alone gives some disproportionality into why you're seeing a change in the numbers. But no, I don't think they're Republicans. There has been a trend in that way on certain issues, some social issues. That's being drummed up again in certain states by certain governors, by the Republican Party, crime and safety issues and the like. So I think there's some reasons on the Republican side too of why they're trying to make a play for that community. But I think things will equalize here on the general ballot. It's still congressional ballot. It's still tied 43-43. I still think Republicans will do well. We've got to work hard. And to your point, Bria, maybe we can push the president to just hold off on that cancellation, a month or so before the election. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah. Well, Will, Melik, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And we'll have more Rising after this.